We'll continue our studies in Romans chapter 11. Earlier in chapter 10, we discussed how God is sovereign in the way that He make a choice. He elects and chooses people like He did the people of God, Israelites, and then He chose the Gentiles. Now, Paul, in connection with to that choice, the sovereignty of God, that God is sovereign in His choice, Paul is raising a question, a pertinent question that would have been raised during his time. So he says in chapter 11, verse 1, did God reject His people? And his answer is, by no means. I am an Israelite, myself a descendant of Abraham from the tribe of Benjamin. What Paul is saying that you cannot generalize just because quite a large number of Jews did not believe and receive Jesus Christ as Messiah, and the gospel went to Gentiles and Gentiles responded. It does not mean that all Israelites rejected. You cannot make a general remark. Paul himself, being a Jew, he accepted Jesus Christ. But at the same time, he says, yes, God did allow Jews to harden their heart. And it was not that God was not in control. He allowed it so that their hardening may become a favor to the Jews, the gospel a favor to the Gentiles. Because of the hardening rejection of the Jews, it became a blessing. God works out good in all circumstances. And then he also is talking about the doctrine, the teaching of the remnant, that in spite of the rejection of some of the Jews who failed to understand Jesus as Messiah and their hearts were hardened, there were some who were remnant. Out of those, there were still people who were good-hearted and wise people who could see the Old Testament and understood very clearly the provision of God through Jesus Christ as the Messiah. And he quotes that it's not only happened in our time, but it happened prior to that, before, in the time of Elijah. When Elijah was very much disappointed and depressed, when everybody had refused or rejected him. In verse 3 says, Elijah was appealing to God, Lord, they have killed your prophets and torn down your altars. I'm the only one left and they are trying to kill me. Now, Elijah was also having the problem of generalizing, they all. But God replied, God's answer to him was, no, that's not entirely correct. I have reserved for myself 7,000 who have not bowed the knee to Baal. So too, at present time, there is a remnant chosen by grace. So what Paul is saying, yes, on the one hand, the Jews did not accept, and because of they did not accept, gospel went to Gentiles. But on the other hand, there are some Jews who are remnant, few chosen, selected, whom God did show His grace, and they were able to understand the grace of God. And so finally he concludes in verse 6, he says, and if by grace, then it is no longer by works. Jews could understand that it is no longer by Mosaic law, but by putting their faith in Jesus Christ, and by grace, the salvation is theirs. Verse 7, what then? What Israel sought so earnestly, it did not obtain, but the elect did it. So these remnant were the one who were elect of God. God had chosen. The others were hardened. God allowed the others to continue in their wickedness, the wickedness of rejection or hardening. He quotes in David saying in verse 9, and it's taken from Psalm 69 verse 22-23, may their table become snare and a trap, a stumbling block and a retribution for them. May their eyes be darkened so they cannot see, and their backs be bent forever. There are times God does allow the hardening of their heart and their own temptation, their own comfort zone, their own weaknesses become their trap. And so they deprive the blessings. Maybe later on they learn in a hard way and they repent and they regret. They may come back. So Paul goes on to argue, verse 11 to all the way to the end of the chapter. He says, yes, they are hardened, and they rejected, and you Gentiles, you made a choice and you became the people of God. But that should not make you arrogant. That should not make you feel despised or look Jews with despise. He says, be careful, just like you were ingrafted and the chosen were rejected. It is possible that you could be also rejected if you become arrogant. So in verse 18 he says, do not boast over those branches. If you do, consider this. You do not support the roots, but the root supports you. You will say then, branches were broken off so that I could be grafted in. Verse 20 says, granted, of course, you were taken in. But they were broken off because of unbelief, and you stand by faith. Do not be arrogant, but be afraid. For if God did not spare the natural branches, He will not spare you either. If God could harden the hearts of the chosen people, the people of book, the people of the covenant, and take away the gospel from them for some time and take it to the Gentiles, to you all, it can also do so. So never take God's grace and mercy, God's love for granted. Never allow the arrogance to come to you, because you could also be hardened. God may allow to hardening, and you may deprive the blessing exactly as the first group of people, the people of God, they were delayed in receiving. And so this is a good way for us as Gentiles, for those of us who have received gospel later, to remain humble and continue to be an instrument in the hands of God, and ensure that we may become a blessing, a channel to others who have not received. May God bless you. I hope you enjoyed Romans chapter 11. We'll continue in chapter 11 and listen what Paul has to say more in the same line. Bye-bye.